In AD 48, the Empress Valeria Messalina, the wife of Claudius, was executed for treason. She was young, beautiful, and powerful, but history does not remember her as a stateswoman or mother. No, her legacy was twisted into something darker, the symbol of lust, the whore of Rome. For centuries her name has been spat like venom, and yet the deeper truth is more complex and more cruel. Welcome, my friends, to another journey into the shadows of history. Before we begin, I ask you to join us in this community of seekers. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already, so you never miss another story whispered from the past. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Are you sitting in the quiet of your bedroom, walking alone beneath the city lights, or lying in the dark, letting the weight of history settle into your thoughts? Let us know in the comments, for history is not just a story of the dead. It is a conversation among the living. Now draw closer, for in the marbled halls of Rome, the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known, words were as deadly as daggers. A sword could cut flesh, a legion could topple a rival, but a rumour could kill a dynasty. And for the women of Rome, rumour was the sharpest weapon of all. The story I'm about to tell you is not one of battles or empires rising. It is a story of whispers. Whispers of adultery, whispers of incest, whispers of monstrous lust. In the marble palaces of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, power was entangled with scandal. The more powerful a woman became, the more vicious the rumours that clung to her name. It begins with Messalina, a young empress executed in her 20s. It stretches through Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, who would one day rule the empire. And it ends with a whisper so grotesque, so unnatural, that it outlived truth itself. The whisper that an empress had lain with her stallions. Step with me now into the Senate House, where orators thunder but whispers carry farther than law. Step into the palaces of the Palatine, where feasts are served under golden ceilings while gossip slithers across the couches. Step into the dark corners of Roman morality, where sex was not private, but public, a stage on which reputation, power, and destruction all played their roles. Imagine the women at the centre of it. Messalina, barely 20, married to an emperor 3 decades her senior, navigating a world of freedmen, generals, and courtiers who saw her as both tool and threat. Agrippina, niece of Claudius, sister of Caligula, mother of Nero, clawing her way from exile back into the throne room of Rome. These were not ordinary women, they were empresses. But to the men around them, their ambition was intolerable, and so they would be destroyed not with armies but with words. The whispers were not accidents, they were weapons. When a rival wished to ruin a woman of the imperial court, he did not accuse her of mismanaging money or breaking law, he accused her of something far more corrosive: lust. If ordinary adultery was not enough, incest was whispered. If incest was not enough, bestiality was conjured. For to accuse a woman of unnatural sex was to strip her of humanity, to mark her as a monster. This was Rome's cruelest whisper. As we begin this story, remember, the truth may never be known. Tacitus, Suetonius, Juvenal, Cassius Dio, all these men wrote the histories, and all of them despised the women who shared power. They recorded what they wanted posterity to believe. They sharpened their quills into blades, and with those blades they carved women into monsters. But tonight, we walk back into those marble halls not to indulge the rumour but to examine it, to ask why these whispers mattered, why they were repeated, and why even now, nearly 2,000 years later, we still speak them aloud. This is the story of Messalina and Agrippina. This is the story of lust, rumour, and power. This is the story of the empress who slept with her stallions, Rome's cruelest whisper. And so, let us begin. In the heart of Rome, the Palatine Hill rose like a fortress of marble and ambition. It was here, behind colonnades and courtyards, that the most powerful men of the empire lived, and the most vulnerable women were watched. To be a woman in the Julio-Claudian dynasty was to live in a world where every gesture could be read, every whisper could become a weapon. You had no office, no title, no army, yet through your womb, your marriage, your sons, you carried the empire itself. In the early empire, women of the imperial household had no formal political power. The Senate was closed to them. The army belonged to men, They could not draft laws or hold magistracies, yet their influence seeped through the cracks of the system. An empress was more than a wife. She was the mother of heirs, the mediator of patronage, the figure who stood at the emperor's side during ceremonies. The Romans, who publicly insisted that women must be silent and obedient, privately understood that the empress's smile or frown could make or break a man's career. Under Augustus, Rome's first emperor, the ideal was set. His wife, Livia Drusilla, became the model of the imperial matron, chaste, dignified, controlled. Yet behind the image, Livia manoeuvred with extraordinary skill. She advised Augustus, she secured her son's and grandson's positions, and after his death she was honoured as Augusta, mother of the empire. Livia was proof that women, though denied the titles of consul or tribune, could wield immense influence in Rome's highest circles. And once that door had been cracked open, it never fully closed again. By the time of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the line of emperors from Augustus through Nero, imperial women were constantly under scrutiny. They were expected to embody Roman virtue, modesty, loyalty, obedience. Their duty was to provide heirs, to keep the bloodline secure, and to uphold the image of the Domus Augusta, the imperial household. Yet these expectations made them uniquely vulnerable. If a man in Rome was accused of corruption, he could be punished and still remembered for his military victories or legal reforms. But if an empress was accused of sexual immorality, the stain could eclipse her entire life. For Rome, female sexuality was political currency. A woman's body was not her own. It was a vessel for dynastic continuity. When she bore a child, it was not simply a son or daughter. It was an heir, a symbol of legitimacy, a potential emperor. Her fertility became a matter of state. The historian Tacitus remarked that the line of emperors rested precariously on the wombs of their women, and so long as a woman bore heirs, she remained useful. But once she was seen as barren, unfaithful, or overly ambitious, she became a liability. This is why rumour became the deadliest weapon. You could not accuse an empress of treason without evidence, but you could whisper about her body, her desires, her alleged lovers. Those whispers could spread faster than armies. They required no proof, because Roman culture was already primed to believe them. After all, wasn't a woman's body naturally weak? Wasn't she more prone to lust, to hysteria, to corruption? So said Roman philosophers, poets, and moralists. And if this was true of ordinary women, how much more dangerous was an empress, whose proximity to power magnified every rumour into legend? Messalina entered this world as a young bride, married to Claudius when she was barely 20. To her enemies, her youth itself was suspicious. What business did a girl have in the emperor's bed, influencing imperial policy, giving birth to heirs who might one day rule Rome? The court watched her every move. When she bore a daughter, Octavia, and later a son, Britannicus, her value rose. But so did the danger. For now she was not just Claudius's wife, she was the mother of Rome's future. Any rival faction that wished to weaken Claudius could not simply attack him. They could attack her, and the easiest way to attack her was to paint her as unchaste. Agrippina the Younger would face an even sharper blade of rumour. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, a woman whose blood tied her directly to Rome's founding dynasty. She was also the sister of Caligula, the mother of Nero, and in time the wife of Claudius. From birth, her life was entangled with politics. Unlike Messalina, who was remembered as a creature of lust, Agrippina was remembered as a creature of power. She was ambitious, cunning, fearless. She did not wait in the shadows. She demanded her place beside emperors. But that visibility carried a price. To men threatened by her authority, she could not be allowed to appear simply political. She had to be recast as unnatural, monstrous, incestuous. In Roman society, women in the imperial court occupied a paradox. They were central to the empire's survival, yet they were treated as potential threats. They were elevated as Augustae, mothers of the state, yet vilified as whores, poisoners, and conspirators. They were indispensable and disposable at the same time, and so the court became a theatre of slander. Freedmen, senators, generals, and rival families all understood how to wield the weapon of rumour. A whisper in the Senate House could become a verse in a satirical poem, a line in a speech, a passage in Tacitus's annals decades later. Soon, What began as gossip transformed into history. That is why, 2,000 years later, we cannot know whether Messalina truly loved Gaius Silius, or whether Agrippina truly lay in bed with her son. What we do know is that such accusations followed a pattern, repeated again and again in Rome's dark imagination. Ambitious women were remembered through the lens of sex and scandal, not power or politics. To understand Messalina and Agrippina, then, we must first understand the cage in which they lived. They were not free to be simply wives, mothers, or advisors. They were symbols. Their bodies were canvases upon which Rome painted its fears of female influence. Their reputations were the battlefield upon which men fought their rivalries. Every glance, every gesture, every moment of affection for a son or a lover could be twisted into evidence of depravity. The marble halls of the Palatine carried more than echoes of footsteps. They carried whispers. Whispers of who was seen dining with whom, who lingered too long in whose chamber, who bore a child whose paternity might be questioned. And once a whisper began, it was almost impossible to silence. For in Rome, scandal was irresistible. Poets like Juvenal thrived on it. Historians like Tacitus fed on it. Audiences craved it. And in a city where entertainment was blood and spectacle, there was no greater spectacle than the fall of a woman who had dared to stand too close to power. Thus, women in the imperial court lived in a permanent state of exposure. Their lives were performances. Their failures were magnified. Their desires, whether real or imagined, were weaponized, and their deaths rarely silenced the rumours. If anything, death only made the whispers louder, because now they could not answer back. Messalina's execution in AD 48 was a political act, but in the memory of Rome it became a moral lesson. This is what happens to the lustful woman, the woman who strays, the woman who wields too much influence. Agrippina's murder in AD 59 was a political necessity for Nero, but in the imagination of later ages it became proof of her monstrous nature, her unnatural bond with her son, her descent into bestiality. To stand as Empress in the Julio-Claudian dynasty was to walk a tightrope strung over an abyss of rumour. A single slip, real or invented, could drag you into the pit. That is the world into which Messalina and Agrippina stepped. That is the stage upon which Rome's cruelest whisper began. She was born into the bloodlines of emperors. Valeria Messalina, remembered now as Rome's most infamous empress, was not a courtesan nor a common woman elevated by chance. She was of the Julian and Claudian stock, the tangled web of kinship that bound together the first dynasty of emperors. Her family connections alone would have guaranteed her proximity to power. But history would remember her not for her lineage, nor for the heirs she bore, but for whispers of lust that have never faded. Messalina was born between AD 17 and 20, though exact records differ. Her father was Marcus Valerius Messala Barbatus, a consul suffectus and descendant of the ancient patrician family of the Valeri, one of the oldest houses of Rome. Her mother was Domitia Lepida the Younger, herself a granddaughter of the triumvir Mark Antony, and Antonia Major, who was the niece of Augustus. This made Messalina the great-granddaughter of Antony, the grandniece of Augustus and the cousin of Caligula. Through her blood ran the tangled heritage of Rome's ruling elite. She grew up in a world of marble porticos, of whispered alliances, of children destined for dynastic marriages. She would have been surrounded from birth by expectations, that her womb would serve the dynasty, that her marriage would be arranged to reinforce power. And so it was. Around AD 38 or 39, when Messalina was about 18 or 20 years old, she was chosen to marry Tiberius Claudius Drusus, known to history as Claudius, uncle of the Emperor Caligula. Claudius at this time was nearly 50 years old, twice Messalina's age. Awkward, limping, and often dismissed by his family as weak-minded because of his stammer and physical disabilities, Claudius had lived much of his life in the shadows of the palace, surviving precisely because no one considered him a threat. His marriages before Messalina had been failures, leaving him childless. When Caligula raised him to prominence as his uncle, he was ripe for a new match. Messalina, young, fertile, of impeccable blood, was the perfect candidate. Their marriage was both political and symbolic. It united the Claudian and Julian lines once again, binding Messalina's Antony Augustan heritage with Claudius's Claudian blood. Within a short time, she proved her worth to the dynasty. She bore 2 children, a daughter, Claudia Octavia, around AD 39, and a son, Tiberius Claudius Britannicus, in February AD 41. With these births, Messalina secured her place as mother of the imperial household. Octavia would one day be married to the future emperor Nero. Britannicus was the biological heir of Claudius. For a brief moment, Messalina's future looked assured. She had given Rome both continuity and stability, but politics in the Julio-Claudian household was never stable for long. In January AD 41, Caligula was assassinated in a plot involving senators and praetorian guards. Chaos erupted in the palace. Soldiers found Claudius cowering behind a curtain, and instead of killing him, they proclaimed him emperor. Suddenly, the awkward uncle became ruler of the Roman world, and Messalina, scarcely 20, became empress. The palace transformed her life overnight. No longer the obscure wife of an imperial relative, she was now Augusta, the Empress of Rome. She had the ear of the emperor, she held the mother of heirs, and she wielded the subtle influence of patronage. Petitioners flocked to her. Freedmen and courtiers sought her favour. Her name appeared on inscriptions beside Claudius's. In statues and reliefs she was presented as the embodiment of pudicitia, Roman modesty and feminine virtue. Yet behind that official image, rumours began to coil. From the beginning, ancient historians hinted that Messalina was not content with the role of dutiful wife. Juvenal, writing decades later, would paint her as insatiable, a woman of monstrous appetites. Tacitus, more restrained, nevertheless suggested that she wielded her youth and sexuality to manipulate Claudius and secure her own allies. Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century, described her as a schemer who destroyed those who opposed her. It is here that the pattern of Rome's cruelest whispers took hold. A young empress, married to an older, awkward emperor, a woman whose fertility gave her extraordinary power. To her enemies, it was all too easy to recast her as a seductress, a monster of lust. For in Rome, women were not supposed to desire power, let alone wield it. And if they did, rumour quickly transformed ambition into sexuality, authority into depravity. Messalina's cousinhood to Caligula and kinship with Nero only deepened the suspicions. Her bloodline was too close to the throne, her influence too visible. While Claudius himself remained cautious, often manipulated by his freedmen, Messalina became a lightning rod for gossip. Every execution of a rival, every downfall of a senator, every whisper of corruption, many later writers pinned it upon her. Whether true or not, Messalina became the convenient villain of Claudius's reign. Yet it is important to remember, in her early years as empress, she was at the very centre of Rome's dynastic hopes. Britannicus, her son, was the future of the Julio-Claudian line. She was his guardian, his shield. In her person, Rome saw both continuity and danger. And so, while she walked through the marbled halls of the Palatine, her every movement was watched, her every gesture interpreted. Ancient sources remind us of this contrast. Tacitus, in Annals 11, portrayed her as manipulative and cruel, arranging the downfall of rivals like Julia Livilla, Claudius's niece, and others who might threaten her position. Suetonius, in Life of Claudius, suggested that she exploited her beauty to control her husband. Juvenal, in Satire 6, turned her into a grotesque caricature, the imperial whore who exhausted even prostitutes. But none of these sources knew her personally. They wrote decades after her death, shaped by political hostility and cultural misogyny. Still, the image stuck. Messalina the Empress was not remembered for giving birth to Octavia and Britannicus, for supporting Claudius in his early reign, or for shaping alliances. She was remembered as Rome's insatiable woman, the Empress who prowled the night. The truth is lost in shadow. Was she truly ambitious and manipulative, orchestrating the downfall of rivals? Almost certainly. Was she lustful beyond measure, as Juvenal claimed? Almost certainly not. But in the memory of Rome, those two strands, ambition and lust, merged until they were indistinguishable. And so, as we step deeper into her story, into the rumours of brothels and sex marathons, into the scandal that ended with her bloody execution in AD 48, we must remember this. Messalina began as a young bride of noble blood, married into the dynasty not for lust but for politics. She bore heirs, She played her role, and she lived in a palace where rumour was deadlier than any sword. Her tragedy was not that she loved too much or desired too wildly. Her tragedy was that she lived in a Rome where powerful women were always turned into monsters, and in the years to come, her name would become synonymous not with the empress she was, but with the scandal Rome demanded she must be. Messalina's place in the imperial palace was secured by blood and children, yet it was never safe. In Rome, the higher a woman climbed, the more eagerly her enemies sought to drag her down. For Messalina, her enemies would not wield only politics, but rumour. Rumour sharpened into the cruelest of weapons, and the stories they told would outlast her life, echoing through centuries as legends of insatiable lust. The most famous of these whispers comes to us from Juvenal, a satirist writing in the late 1st or early 2nd century AD. In his Satire 6, Juvenal sought to warn Roman men of the dangers of women. He filled his poem with grotesque caricatures of female depravity, and at the very heart of his venom he placed Messalina. He claimed that the Empress disguised herself and entered brothels at night, competing with prostitutes for endurance. His words are cruel, mocking, unforgettable. Messalina, the Augusta, would slip away from the Palatine palace, exchange her silks for the rough cloak of a harlot, and under the name Lysiska, meaning the she-wolf, she would open her door to all men until, exhausted, she stumbled back to her imperial bed. Juvenal sharpened the image further with a contest of lust. He declared that Messalina once challenged a celebrated prostitute to a sexual marathon, and that the Empress won, satisfying 25 men in a single day. To Juvenal's audience, this was not merely scandalous, it was monstrous. For a Roman empress to appear as insatiable as the lowest whore inverted every cultural expectation of pudicitia, the chastity and modesty expected of high-born women. But Juvenal was not a historian, he was a satirist, and satire thrives on exaggeration. His goal was not to record truth, but to paint a grotesque canvas of moral corruption. He wanted his readers to shudder, to sneer, to laugh bitterly. By choosing Messalina, he chose a figure already darkened by reputation. In his telling, she was not a woman, but a warning, not a mother of heirs, but a symbol of Rome's rotting morality. Still, Juvenal was not alone. Other writers repeated similar whispers. Tacitus, in his Annals, Book 11, though more restrained, suggested that Messalina was ruled by ungovernable desires. He portrayed her as a predator in the palace, arranging the downfall of rivals and indulging passions unchecked. Tacitus did not describe brothel visits or sexual contests, but he hinted at an empress who treated her marriage vows lightly, who wielded her body as easily as her political influence. To him, Messalina's lust was inseparable from her ambition. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, Book 10, contributed an anecdote that fueled the legend. He reported that Messalina competed with a leading prostitute in endurance, and that she outlasted her rival. Though brief, the story reinforced the theme, that her defining trait was not beauty, nor wit, nor diplomacy, but appetite. Later, Cassius Dio, Roman History, Book 60, added his own colouring. Writing in the 3rd century, Dio described Messalina as shameless, corrupt, a woman who used her sexuality to dominate her husband and manipulate the court. He repeated tales of her excess, suggesting that she embodied Rome's decline into decadence. By the time Dio wrote, the image of Messalina as Rome's great harlot was already fixed in the cultural memory. But how much of this was true? Here lies the historian's challenge. The stories of Messalina's sexual marathons come only from hostile sources, written decades after her death, by men with reasons to despise women of power. Tacitus and Juvenal belonged to a senatorial class that viewed the imperial household with suspicion, especially the women who seemed to influence emperors behind closed doors. By casting Messalina as depraved, they turned her into a scapegoat, a symbol of the corruption they believed infected Rome. And yet, the whispers stuck, precisely because they struck at Rome's deepest anxieties. Roman culture valued female chastity above almost all other virtues. An empress was expected to embody pudicitia, to be the mother, the moral exemplar, the opposite of indulgence. By portraying Messalina as a creature of unbounded desire, her enemies inverted this role. They made her not the guardian of Rome's future, but its corrupter. She became the antithesis of pudicitia, a whore on the throne. Consider how the rumour spread. Satirists exaggerated for effect. Gossip at court repeated every whisper. Political enemies of Claudius, senators who despised his freedmen advisers, rivals who saw Messalina as a threat, circulated stories to undermine her, and by the time historians like Tacitus recorded them, the tales had already hardened into truth. But there are reasons to doubt. Claudius, though often depicted as gullible, was not blind. He depended on Messalina for heirs, and for several years she was his visible partner in rule. Could he truly have been unaware if his wife was secretly working in brothels? Could the mother of Britannicus and Octavia really have vanished from the palace night after night without notice? It is possible, but it strains belief. The brothel story may reflect more about Rome's fears than Messalina's deeds. By linking an empress to prostitution, Rome symbolically degraded the entire imperial household. The empress, who should embody virtue, was recast as the lowest of women. It was a story too delicious, too horrifying to ever be forgotten, and once written down, it became immortal. Modern scholars often interpret these tales as political slander, just as later rumours accused Agrippina of incest with her son Nero and Cleopatra of seducing whole empires, so too was Messalina cast in sexual grotesque. In each case, a powerful woman was reduced to a figure of lust, as if her ambition could only be explained by insatiable desire. But the power of these whispers cannot be dismissed. Even now, nearly 2 millennia later, the first fact many remember about Messalina is not her lineage, not her children, not her political influence, but Juvenal's lurid story of 25 men. It clings to her name, staining her legacy. The tragedy of Messalina is not merely that she was executed in her youth, nor that she fell victim to palace intrigue. It is that her memory was rewritten by rumour. Every act of ambition became evidence of lust. Every whisper became history. And though she was no more lascivious than countless Roman men, it was she who bore the eternal mark of shame. In the shadows of the Palatine, Messalina walked as Empress. But in the pages of history, she walks forever as Juvenal's creation, the insatiable harlot, the woman who could never be satisfied, the Empress who abandoned her bed for brothels. Whether true or false, the rumour has outlived the woman. If there was one rumour that defined Messalina above all others, it was not merely her lust, but her alleged descent into the lowest corners of Roman society. Juvenal's Satire 6 had already painted her as a woman insatiable, but he sharpened his pen further with an image more shocking still. The Empress of Rome, slipping from the marble halls of the Palatine at night, cloaked and veiled, descending into the shadows of the Subura and entering a brothel. Here, according to Juvenal, Messalina took on a false name, Lysiska, the she-wolf. It was a name chosen with precision. The Lupa, or she-wolf, was both Rome's founding mother, who nursed Romulus and Remus, and also a slang word for prostitute. To call Messalina Lysiska was to strip away her imperial dignity, to conflate the mother of Britannicus and Octavia with the lowest harlot on the streets. Juvenal's lines are vivid. He describes how the Empress, abandoning her silks and jewels, would stand naked with gilded nipples, her womb open for hire, her belly marked with the lash, as she took coin from anonymous men. The passage is not history, but satire, yet its cruelty ensured that this image of Messalina working as a common prostitute would echo for centuries. Other ancient authors repeated and embroidered the tale. Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century, Roman History, Book 60, claimed that Messalina spent her nights in brothels, driven by an appetite beyond reason. According to Dio, she would remain there until even the prostitutes begged her to leave, exhausted while she demanded more. Dio framed this not as comedy, but as pathology, the Empress as a creature of uncontrollable lust, a monster in the shape of a woman. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder also included a brief reference in his Natural History, Book 10, Section 83, noting that Messalina had challenged a prostitute to an endurance contest. Pliny's version, though spare, added authority to the rumour, lending it the weight of fact rather than satire. But the most striking feature of these accounts is how seamlessly they blend the palace with the brothel. To Romans, the brothel, lupanar, was the symbol of degradation, the very opposite of imperial dignity. Prostitutes worked in cubicles, each with a crude fresco advertising services, often for as little as 2 asses, the price of a loaf of bread. By placing Messalina among them, her enemies collapsed the distance between Rome's throne and its gutter. Why would such a story take root? The answer lies in the politics of slander. Messalina was young, powerful and fertile. She had given Claudius 2 children, Octavia, born circa AD 39/40, and Britannicus, born AD 41, the same year Claudius became emperor. Through them, she held dynastic weight. If Claudius had died in the 40s, Britannicus would have been heir. That made Messalina not merely an empress, but a queenmaker, the guardian of Rome's future. For Claudius's freedmen advisors, Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus, Messalina's influence was a threat. For senators, she was the embodiment of imperial arrogance, and for Claudius's rivals, she was a target too dangerous to attack directly. To tarnish her was to tarnish Claudius, and so, what better weapon than sex? The brothel rumour served several purposes. It degraded Messalina personally. It suggested that Claudius was blind, cuckolded, incapable of ruling his own household, and thus unfit to rule Rome. And it cast the entire imperial household as decadent, a palace where emperors married whores and dynasties descended from corruption. Tacitus, our most sober source, does not describe brothels. In Annals 11, he focuses instead on her affair with Gaius Silius, the senator she would marry in AD 48. Yet even Tacitus does not resist the temptation to describe her lust as uncontrollable, her shame as none. For him, her crime was not prostitution but hubris, treating the empire as her plaything, daring to wed another man while Claudius still lived. But the absence of brothels in Tacitus only sharpens the point. The most lurid stories come not from contemporary witnesses, but from later writers who crafted her as legend. Modern historians almost universally reject the literal truth of the brothel tales. The logistics alone are implausible. How could the Empress vanish night after night from the heavily guarded Palatine? How could she slip unrecognised through Rome's crowded streets? And why would a woman of such power seek out the lowest, most degrading form of sex? The answer is likely simple: she did not. The brothel was not her reality, but her metaphor. It was the symbol chosen by enemies to represent the collapse of her dignity. And yet, the story proved indestructible. By late antiquity, Christian writers such as St. Jerome, 4th century, repeated Messalina's sins as examples of pagan depravity. Medieval chroniclers embroidered them further, sometimes claiming she coupled with gladiators, sometimes suggesting she embodied unnatural lusts. The prostitute empress became a stock character in moral sermons, a cautionary tale against female ambition. It is telling that her supposed brothel name, Lycisca, echoes still. In Roman slang, a wolf, lupa, was a whore. The very founding story of Rome, the twins Romulus and Remus suckled by a she-wolf, was itself layered with sexual pun. To call Messalina Lycisca was to mark her as a she-wolf in both senses, the mother of Rome and its prostitute. The irony is sharp. Messalina, as empress, presided over the highest rituals of Roman religion. She held the title of Augusta. She was priestess, mother, dynastic matron. She represented the moral order of Rome. And yet, in the satirical imagination, she was pictured in the very opposite setting, naked on a straw pallet in a darkened room, waiting for anonymous men to buy her for coins. That inversion was the point. To humiliate an empress, it was not enough to accuse her of adultery. Adultery was common, even among aristocrats. To truly destroy her, she had to be imagined as descending to the lowest possible station. To make the emperor's wife a whore was to strip the dynasty of legitimacy itself. So the story endured. Messalina the prostitute. Messalina the brothel queen. Messalina who preferred the filthy cubicles of the Subura to the marble of the Palatine. Whether she lived that life or not mattered little. The rumour had become history. In truth, the only brothel Messalina entered was the brothel of memory, the one constructed by Rome's satirists and historians. She entered it unwillingly, dragged by hostile pens, and she has never left. Even now, when we speak her name, it is not as the mother of Octavia, the empress who linked the Julio-Claudians, or the political player who fell in AD 48. It is as Juvenal's creation, Lycisca, the whore of Rome. The The rumours of Messalina's lust, the brothel, the prostitutes, the endless appetite, were dangerous, but for years they remained whispers. They painted her as corrupt, but not yet as treasonous. That would change in the year AD 48, when her ambition, her carelessness, or perhaps her desperation, brought her down in one of the strangest and most shocking episodes in Roman history. The man at the centre of her downfall was Gaius Silius, a young and handsome senator. Tacitus, Annals 11:12-38, tells us that Silius was known for his noble birth and striking appearance. In the rigid world of the Roman elite, he was already married to a woman named Junia Silana, herself of high standing, a friend of Agrippina the Younger. Yet by 47 or 48, Silius was entangled in Messalina's orbit. Whether it began as lust or as politics, the affair quickly became notorious. According to Tacitus, Messalina's relationship with Silius was not merely an adulterous dalliance. It became an open partnership. She moved him into the imperial circle, lavished him with wealth and influence, and made little effort to hide her preference. Suetonius, in his Life of Claudius, 26, would later remark on the extraordinary brazenness of the affair. Cassius Dio, LX 18, went further, suggesting that Messalina had enslaved Claudius with sex while she carried on openly with Silius. But why Silius? The sources are divided. Some suggest genuine passion, that Messalina, not yet 30, simply burned with desire for the senator. Others argue political calculation. By 48, Messalina was secure as Claudius's wife and mother of his children, but she was surrounded by enemies. Claudius's freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus, resented her power. Rival women, including Agrippina the Younger, loomed as potential threats. If Claudius were to die suddenly, Messalina's son Britannicus, still a boy of 7, would need protection. A new husband, strong and politically connected, could secure her regency. Silius, ambitious and attractive, fit the role. What happened next has puzzled historians for centuries. In October AD 48, Messalina and Silius staged what Tacitus calls a mock marriage. While Claudius was away at Ostia inspecting the harbour works, Messalina and Silius held a wedding ceremony in Rome. The ritual was public, conducted with witnesses, complete with dowry, auspices and sacrifices. It was in effect treason, an empress marrying another man while her husband still reigned. Tacitus is incredulous. Whether it was out of madness or arrogance is uncertain, he writes, Annals 11.26. Some ancient commentators believed the wedding was a symbolic gesture, a parody of Roman marriage laws. Others thought Messalina truly sought to depose Claudius and crown Silius emperor in his place. Cassius Dio reports that Silius pressed her to act, fearing discovery. Either we must act, or we perish. The timing could not have been worse. Claudius, though often portrayed as weak or gullible, was surrounded by shrewd freedmen. Chief among them was Narcissus, his secretary. Narcissus had long despised Messalina. When word of the marriage reached him, he acted swiftly. He feared that if Claudius heard the rumour from Messalina first, she might spin it as a misunderstanding. So Narcissus rushed to Ostia and delivered the news directly. The empress had taken a new husband. Tacitus recounts the emperor's confusion. Claudius, ever hesitant, could hardly believe it. But Narcissus drove the point home. He reminded Claudius of his precarious position, mocked as a fool, manipulated by women, threatened by conspiracies. At last Claudius relented. He returned to Rome with Narcissus at his side, determined to act. Meanwhile, Messalina and Silius celebrated. They paraded openly, hosting feasts, acting as though they were the new imperial couple. Tacitus paints a surreal scene. Rome's aristocrats, fearing the winds of power, joined in the revelry. Even senators attended the mock wedding, hedging their bets in case Silius truly supplanted Claudius. The line between rumour and rebellion had blurred. When Claudius entered Rome, Narcissus took no chances. He surrounded the emperor with loyal guards, cutting off Messalina's access. He ordered the arrest of Silius and his associates. One by one they were dragged before Claudius. Silius, according to Tacitus, Annals 11.29, did not beg for mercy. Knowing the futility, he asked only for a swift death, and received it. Messalina, however, was still at large. Realizing the danger, she fled to the gardens of Lucullus, a luxurious estate she had claimed. There, Tacitus describes her in panic, torn between pleading and despair. She sent messages to Claudius begging to see him. She sent her children, Octavia and Britannicus, to soften their father's heart. Claudius, weak as ever, began to waver. He ordered her brought to him the next day, leaving room for hope. But Narcissus feared reprieve. He knew Claudius's vacillation. He knew Messalina's tears might sway him, and so he acted without waiting. In the gardens, a band of soldiers cornered Messalina. Tacitus describes her final moments with tragic detail. She clutched her mother, Lepida, who urged her to accept death with dignity. Messalina, unaccustomed to violence, faltered. She tried to seize a dagger, but her courage failed. At last, a soldier struck her down. She was not yet 30 years old. It was autumn AD 48. The woman who had once been Rome's most powerful empress was dead. Claudius, when told, finished his meal in silence, neither celebrating nor mourning. Soon after, her name was erased from inscriptions, her statues torn down, yet her memory did not fade. Tacitus and Dio framed her as a warning of unbridled lust. Juvenal immortalized her as Rome's prostitute queen. Christian writers turned her into a symbol of pagan decadence, and in later centuries her story merged with legend. Messalina became not just a historical figure, but an archetype of the wicked woman, the adulterous wife, the empress who could not control her body or her ambition. Modern historians still debate her fall. Was the marriage to Silius a desperate plot to secure Britannicus's future? Was it truly a conspiracy to overthrow Claudius, or merely a bizarre scandal misinterpreted as treason? Was it, perhaps, a fabrication by Narcissus and his allies, exaggerated to rid themselves of a dangerous rival? The sources are hostile, coloured by misogyny and senatorial disdain. The truth is tangled, but the outcome is clear. Messalina's downfall cemented her legacy as Rome's fallen empress. Her children's fates would be grim. Britannicus, once heir, would be poisoned in AD 55 at the orders of his stepbrother Nero. Octavia, Claudius's daughter, would be forced to marry Nero in AD 53 only to be divorced and executed in AD 62. Messalina's bloodline was extinguished, her dynasty erased, and yet her shadow lingered. The brothels of Juvenal, the wedding with Silius, the gardens of Lucullus, each became set pieces in the theatre of Roman memory. For centuries, preachers and poets alike invoked her name as shorthand for female lust and betrayal. Messalina, dead at 30, lived on as myth. In the end, the truth of her fall may be less salacious than the legend. Perhaps she was reckless, perhaps ambitious, perhaps simply trapped in the vicious politics of the Julio-Claudian court. But in Rome, truth mattered little. Narrative was power, and the narrative of Messalina, prostitute, adulteress, traitor, was too useful to die. The death of Messalina in AD 48 left a vacuum in Rome's imperial household. Claudius, now without a wife, was vulnerable. An emperor mocked as a fool, easily swayed, in need of a woman who could stabilize his household and his dynasty. The stage was set for another woman of the Julio-Claudian bloodline, one more calculating than Messalina, and one whose name would echo in scandal for centuries, Julia Agrippina the Younger. Born on the 6th of November, Anno Domini 15, Agrippina was no stranger to the bloodlines of power. She was the daughter of Germanicus, Rome's beloved general, and Agrippina the Elder, herself the granddaughter of Augustus. Her brother was Gaius Caligula, who would reign from AD 37 to 41. By birth, Agrippina was one of the most aristocratic women in the empire, tied directly to Augustus, to the Julian and Claudian houses alike. Her childhood was marked by violence and exile. After the death of Germanicus in AD 19, Agrippina the Elder quarrelled with the Emperor Tiberius. The family fell into suspicion. Her brothers were imprisoned or executed. Agrippina herself was exiled to the island of Pontia during Caligula's reign, accused of adultery with Marcus Lepidus. Only after Caligula's assassination in AD 41 did she return to Rome, recalled under the new Emperor Claudius, her uncle. By then she had already been married twice. Her first husband was Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, to whom she bore a son in AD 37, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the boy who would become Nero. Domitius died in AD 40, leaving her widowed at 25. Her second marriage was to Passienus Crispus, a wealthy senator, but he too died, allegedly poisoned by Agrippina around AD 47. She returned to court a widow once again, with Nero as her only child. When Messalina was executed in AD 48, the path opened. Claudius's advisers debated whom he should marry next. Some proposed women from outside the Julio-Claudian bloodline, but Agrippina was ambitious, patient, and perfectly positioned. She was not just a widow of noble standing, she was Claudius's own niece. That marriage had never before been legal in Rome. An uncle marrying his brother's daughter was incest under traditional Roman law, but Agrippina lobbied, and Claudius, persuaded by his advisers, and perhaps by Agrippina's determination, pushed through a senatorial decree in AD 49 legalizing uncle-niece marriage. For the first time in Rome's history, such a union was sanctioned. That year, Agrippina and Claudius married. She became Augusta, the Empress, and immediately began shaping the court to her design. She manoeuvred her enemies into exile, secured wealth and honours for her supporters, and, most importantly, advanced the position of her son, Nero. In AD 50, Claudius formally adopted Nero, changing his name to Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. This adoption placed Nero ahead of Britannicus, Claudius's natural son by Messalina, who was younger. With adoption, Nero was now styled as Claudius's heir, his education overseen by the philosopher Seneca the Younger. Agrippina had achieved what Messalina had once dreamed of, positioning her child as the future emperor. Ancient writers were quick to notice Agrippina's presence. Tacitus, Annals 12.7, describes her as a woman of masculine ambition, one who cloaked her power with feminine grace. Suetonius, Life of Claudius 26-29, remarks on her dominance over Claudius, suggesting that she guided his decrees and appointments. Coins from this period even show Agrippina facing Claudius as an equal, an unprecedented public pairing, with her portrait nearly the same size as his. But with power came suspicion. Agrippina was accused of ruthlessness. In AD 51, she allegedly poisoned Lucius Junius Silanus, a rival to Nero's succession. In AD 52, she was granted the honorific title of Augusta, an elevation that put her in the rare company of Livia, wife of Augustus. The Senate allowed her to ride in a covered carriage, a symbol of majesty. She sat beside Claudius in public ceremonies, appearing less like a wife and more like a co-ruler. Her dominance was not confined to politics. Tacitus whispers of incestuous closeness between Agrippina and her son Nero. By the mid-50s, Rome buzzed with rumour. Agrippina was said to dine with Nero in ways considered improper, to share his litter, even to kiss him too long. In one notorious passage, Annals 14.2, Tacitus claims she entered Nero's chamber in revealing dress, as though to seduce him. Suetonius, Nero 28, repeats the accusations. Agrippina, he says, would allow herself to be kissed too intimately, arousing suspicion of something more. This is where fact and rumour intertwine. Agrippina was undeniably close to Nero. As his mother and political sponsor, she had every reason to maintain intimacy. But in a society obsessed with controlling female sexuality, that closeness became fodder for scandal. Rome did not imagine mothers as advisors, it imagined them as lovers, and so the story of Agrippina became less about her politics and more about her body. The rumours of incest were accompanied by darker whispers still. Later sources embroidered the tale with monstrous exaggerations, suggesting Agrippina's lust was not merely for her son, but for beasts. Medieval chroniclers, retelling the stories of Tacitus and Suetonius, claim that she was accused of coupling with stallions. No contemporary Roman source explicitly records such a charge, but the seeds of bestiality were planted in the Roman imagination. Agrippina as a woman of unnatural lust, a mother who blurred every boundary. Even without those later additions, Agrippina's hold over Nero was enough to disturb Roman sensibilities. As Claudius aged, her power became more threatening. Tacitus reports that by AD 54, Claudius began to regret marrying her. He showed new affection for Britannicus, hinting that perhaps his biological son, not Nero, should inherit. Agrippina, seeing her plans endangered, allegedly acted. In October AD 54, Claudius dined in the palace and consumed mushrooms. Within hours, he was gravely ill. Suetonius, Life of Claudius 44, claims the mushrooms were poisoned, prepared by his food taster Halitus at Agrippina's order. Tacitus is more cautious, but he too suggests that Agrippina orchestrated the poisoning. On the 13th of October AD 54, Claudius died. He was 63 years old. The next morning, Nero, aged 16, was proclaimed emperor. Agrippina stood at his side, triumphant. The Senate confirmed the succession. Coins were minted with her image facing Nero's, the mother beside the son, an icon of shared rule. But the very success that secured her place would also damn her name. Agrippina had risen higher than any woman in Roman history, but at the cost of inviting scandal. To her enemies, she was not a stateswoman. She was a seductress, a poisoner, a woman who slept with her son and even with beasts. Her power was undeniable, but her reputation would forever be entwined with whispers of incest and monstrous lust. Her story did not end in AD 54. For 5 more years, she would attempt to hold sway over Nero, and for 5 more years rumour and suspicion would cling to her. But already in the eyes of history, Agrippina the Younger had become the archetype of the dangerous empress, ambitious, ruthless, and tainted by scandal. Whispers can spread faster than armies. In Rome, they could topple emperors, and in the case of Agrippina the Younger and her son Nero, the whispers took on a poisonous shape, that of incest. From the moment Nero mounted the throne in AD 54, guided by his 16-year-old uncertainty and his mother's iron will, Rome buzzed with speculation. Agrippina had clawed her way into power, not as an official magistrate, for Roman women could hold no office, but as a mother who stood beside the new princeps, whispering in his ear, sharing his chambers, dictating his policies. To her supporters she was the Augusta, the noble matron continuing the line of Augustus. To her enemies she was something more sinister, a woman who wielded too much intimacy, too much influence over her son. Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, captures the mood. In Annals 13.2 he recounts that Agrippina was seen so excessive in her fondness that she was believed to have offered herself to him. He writes that Agrippina, when Nero began to resist her political hold, sought to regain him through her body, entering his room, dressing with deliberate sensuality, using a mother's authority as a lover's lure. Tacitus does not claim the incest was fact, but the insinuation is clear. Rome believed it possible. Suetonius, in Life of Nero 28, echoes the suspicion. He describes Agrippina allowing herself to be kissed by Nero too openly, too intimately, as though she were his mistress. Cassius Dio, writing later, book 62.28, adds that Nero was often seen travelling with her in the same litter, reclining at banquets with her, behaving in ways that scandalized Roman observers. The truth may never be known. Did Agrippina and Nero truly cross that line? Or was it merely the perception of closeness, distorted by hostile eyes into something more salacious? To the Romans, the distinction hardly mattered. Appearances alone could convict. The context made the whispers all the more believable. Incest was not unknown in royal dynasties. Among the Ptolemies of Egypt, brother married sister openly, to preserve bloodlines and legitimacy. Roman writers sneered at this, but fascination lingered. Agrippina, descended from Augustus and linked by blood to Caligula, was already seen as touched by the excesses of monarchy. If Egyptians could wed within their family, why not the Julio-Claudians? Moreover, Roman gossip thrived on contradiction. A woman too chaste was accused of frigidity, a woman too affectionate of lust. Agrippina walked in public with Nero, rode beside him, appeared on coinage with her portrait facing his, an extraordinary display that suggested equality. In a culture where women were meant to remain in the shadows, such visibility invited sexualized slander. The rumours reached their peak in AD 55. By then, Nero had begun to pull away from his mother's control. He resented her domination, her constant interference. Agrippina had arranged his marriage to Octavia, daughter of Claudius and Messalina, binding him to the Julio-Claudian line. But Nero's heart belonged to Acte, a freedwoman. Agrippina disapproved, seeing Acte as a threat to her influence. She mocked Nero, warning him that his affair with a low-born slave would disgrace the throne. It was at this time, according to Tacitus, Annals 13.13, that Agrippina tried to regain her power through insinuated seduction. He paints the image of a mother turning to forbidden intimacy to tether her son. Was this fact, or was Tacitus projecting the darkest possibilities of maternal ambition? The Senate, the court, the people, all whispered. Foreign ambassadors carried tales back to their own lands, the Empress who shared her son's bed, the Augusta who blurred the sacred boundaries of mother and wife. To some, it was proof that Rome had fallen into degeneracy. To others, it was political theatre, the ultimate weapon to tarnish Agrippina's regency. The effect on Nero was profound. Whether true or false, the rumours became a burden. To assert independence, he began dismantling his mother's power. In AD 55, he dismissed her from the palace, denying her entry to the imperial bedchambers. Agrippina was forced to move into a separate residence, though she still retained wealth and honour. The gesture symbolised more than a family quarrel. It was an attempt to silence the whisper, to show Rome that he was no longer his mother's puppet, nor her lover. Yet the suspicion did not fade. In fact, it evolved. Tacitus later recounts how, in AD 58, when Nero had become entangled with Poppaea Sabina, Agrippina sought to preserve her standing by exploiting the gossip itself. Enemies accused her of playing the jealous mistress, scornful that Nero preferred another woman. The incest narrative had grown so entrenched that it could be weaponized in any direction. Proof of her lust if she clung to him, proof of her jealousy if he turned away. It is here that one sees the deeper truth. The accusations of incest tell us less about Agrippina's bedroom than about Roman fears of female power. A mother who shaped the succession, who sat in public beside an emperor, who appeared on coinage as an equal. This was an inversion of the Roman order. To explain it, men reached for the language of perversion. Incest was the ultimate inversion of nature, the perfect metaphor for female influence that felt unnatural. What of Nero himself? Some sources claim he played into the scandal deliberately. In moments of rebellion, he flaunted Acti, flaunted Poppaea, flaunted mistresses and debauchery as proof that his desires lay elsewhere. Yet at the same time, he could not escape the maternal bond. Agrippina had raised him, secured his throne, defended his legitimacy. To Rome, the closeness of that relationship could only be explained by imagining the bed as well as the cradle. By the time Agrippina was murdered in AD 59, the rumours had done their work. Her image was sealed, not as a stateswoman, but as a seductress. Nero would later sneer in Suetonius's telling that he wished he could bed all the mothers of Rome, a cruel joke that mocked the very scandal attached to his own mother. Historians have debated for centuries. Some, like modern scholars Anthony Barrett and Miriam Griffin, see the charges of incest as implausible slander, a product of senatorial bias. Others note that the sheer persistence of the rumour across multiple sources suggests some grain of impropriety in public conduct, if not in private fact. But certainty eludes us. The whispers were never meant to preserve truth. They were meant to destroy, and destroy they did. Agrippina, remembered in coins and decrees as Augusta, became remembered in chronicles as the woman who blurred the line between mother and mistress. Rome's cruelest judgment was not upon her politics, her diplomacy, or even her alleged crimes of poisoning. It was upon her body, reduced to a scandal that still haunts her name. The empress who guided Nero into power became in memory the empress who lay beside him. Whether or not the bed was ever shared, the rumour itself was enough. In Rome, perception was reality. And in Rome, rumour was stronger than fact. Rome had many cruelties, but perhaps the cruelest was this: when a woman could not be destroyed in life, her memory was slaughtered in death. With Agrippina the Younger, as with Messalina before her, the blade of rumour kept cutting long after their bodies were cold, and among those rumours none dripped with more venom than the whisper that Agrippina's lust reached beyond her son, to the very stallions of the imperial stables. Let us be clear at the beginning, no ancient Roman historian, not Tacitus, not Suetonius, not Cassius Dio, ever wrote that Agrippina engaged in bestiality. The canonical sources, written between the 1st and 3rd centuries, focus instead on accusations of incest, ambition, and poison. Tacitus in Annals 13-14 recounts her attempts to control Nero. Suetonius, Nero 28, delights in salacious hints of mother-son intimacy. Dio, writing later, embellishes her schemes for power, but horses, stallions, there is silence. So where does the whisper arise? The answer lies in the centuries that followed Rome's fall, when medieval chroniclers and moralists reworked the legends of the Caesars. In their hands, Agrippina was no longer simply an ambitious woman. She became a symbol of unrestrained female corruption, and nothing symbolized corruption more grotesquely than sex with beasts. The first shadows of this appear in the later Roman world, when writers like Ammianus Marcellinus, 4th century AD, used the language of unnatural lust, contra naturam, as a shorthand for political and moral disorder. By the early Middle Ages, Christian moralists began attaching bestiality charges to figures who embodied depravity. Agrippina, already remembered as the mother who lay too close to her son, became a fertile target. By the 12th century, chroniclers in Europe began stitching together a darker tapestry. In the anonymous Gesta Romanorum, a collection of moralizing tales, Roman empresses appear as archetypes of sin. Agrippina is depicted not only as incestuous, but as monstrously lustful, in some versions, joining with beasts as though no man could satisfy her. These are not records of history, but sermons, intended to terrify medieval audiences with the wages of female ambition. The Stallions enter most vividly in late medieval and early Renaissance accounts. Chroniclers hostile to the pagan past claimed that Agrippina in her excess had turned to the imperial stables. The rumour hardened into a grotesque caricature. The Empress who spread her body beneath her own horses, who demanded that brute beasts serve her where men could not. By the 15th century, in popular retellings of Rome's corruption, the image was complete. Agrippina the horse lover, Agrippina the monster. Why horses? The symbolism is no accident. In Roman culture, the stallion was power, virility, unrestrained force. To accuse a woman of coupling with a horse was to say she had gone beyond human limits, that her lust was not merely immoral, but against nature itself. Bestiality, more than adultery or incest, represented chaos. It was the unmaking of order, the shattering of the human divine boundary. For an empress charged with embodying Rome's dignity, such an accusation was annihilation. And yet, when we return to the ancient sources, we find none of this. Tacitus paints Agrippina as ruthless, ambitious, willing to murder even Claudius to secure Nero's crown. He loathes her dominance but never paints her with the brush of beasts. Suetonius delights in sexual gossip, but his cruelty stops at Nero's bed. Cassius Dio condemns her manipulations but does not cast her into the stables. The horse myth, then, is not Roman history, but medieval invention. Still, its persistence reveals a deeper truth about memory. For Rome and for later Europe, Agrippina became the archetype of a dangerous woman. Messalina was remembered for lust, Agrippina for incest and poison. But when medieval scribes wanted to go further, when they wanted to show female corruption not as vice but as monstrosity, they reached for bestiality. Thus the whisper of the Stallions was born. The accusation also tells us something about the transformation of Rome's legacy. By the Middle Ages, Rome was no longer admired as the empire of Augustus and Caesar. It was a cautionary tale, a fallen world that had worshipped false gods, drowned in decadence, and collapsed under its own sin. To retell Rome's history was to retell its vices, and what vice could be darker than an empress mating with horses? Consider the irony. Agrippina in her own life fought not to indulge lust but to secure power. She manoeuvred marriages, alliances, and succession. She placed Nero on the throne, steered policy in the first years of his reign, and for a time was perhaps the most powerful woman Rome had ever seen. Her enemies could not tolerate that, so they reduced her to the language of the body. First incest, later beasts. The higher she rose, the lower they dragged her memory. Even Renaissance scholars, when rediscovering Tacitus and Suetonius, sometimes repeated the medieval editions without question. The stallion rumour seeped into the cultural imagination. By the 16th century, plays and pamphlets painted Agrippina as the embodiment of unnatural lust. Her name paired alongside Messalina in lists of women without shame. It is here we see the final cruelty, how the memory of a woman can be shaped less by what she did than by what was whispered about her. The Stallions were never real. No Roman writer saw her in the stables, no senator recorded such depravity. But the rumour became her afterlife, a grotesque myth more powerful than truth, and so the empress who shaped emperors was remembered as the empress who lay with beasts. History became fable became memory, and memory became the only truth that endured. The whisper outlived her body by more than a millennium, and even today, when one searches her name in the annals of infamy, the Stallions still stand in the shadows, a cruel reminder of how rumour can ride further than fact. To understand why later chroniclers chose to stain Agrippina with the charge of bestiality, we must step back and look at the cultural landscape of Rome and the world that followed it. The accusation of lying with beasts was not random, not simply a grotesque embellishment for shock. It carried with it a depth of meaning, a symbolic destruction that went beyond adultery, beyond incest, beyond poison. In the moral universe of the Romans, sex was not a private act, but a public and political reality. It was linked to hierarchy, order, and the natural structure of the cosmos. Roman law, Roman religion, and Roman philosophy all agreed. Sex had boundaries, and to cross them was to threaten the fabric of society itself. For a man, honour came in the role of the penetrator, never the penetrated. For a woman, honour came in fidelity, chastity, and the maintenance of the household. These were not merely personal virtues, they were public expectations. A family's dignity rested on them. A dynasty's survival demanded them. Now imagine what it meant to accuse a woman not only of breaking fidelity, not only of desiring her son, but of desiring the brute power of animals. In Roman thought, this was not just vice. It was chaos. It was against nature, contra naturam. And in Roman philosophy, that phrase did not mean simply strange, it meant cosmic disorder. Consider the philosopher Cicero, writing in the 1st century BC. In De Officiis, he spoke of how humanity was separated from beasts by reason, by restraint, by the control of appetite. To collapse that boundary, to mix human with animal, was to undo the very dignity of mankind. Later Stoics reinforced this. The natural order they believed reflected divine reason, logos. To transgress it through acts like bestiality was to turn one's back on reason and descend into a subhuman state. And so, when medieval chroniclers whispered that Agrippina gave herself to her stallions, they were not merely painting her as lustful. They were casting her as anti-human, anti-natural, monstrous. To say she had lovers among men was slander. To say she had lovers among beasts was annihilation. This is why Roman writers themselves, when they wanted to attack women, rarely went so far. Juvenal, in his 6th satire, late 1st, early 2nd century AD, came close. He sneered that Messalina, wife of Claudius, crept from the palace to sell herself in a brothel under the name Lysiska. He said she competed with prostitutes to see who could take more men. He called her an nymphomaniac. Yet even Juvenal, whose ink was black with misogyny, did not charge her with beasts. That line was too far for Roman satire. It belonged to another world, a world where Christian moralists centuries later wanted to show the total corruption of pagan Rome. For Christians too, bestiality had a terrifying place. In the book of Leviticus, 1823, 2015-16, the law is clear. A man shall not lie with a beast, nor a woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is confusion, the text says, and the penalty is death. Early Christian thinkers carried this forward. Augustine, in the 4th century, listed bestiality among the most grievous sins, not only unlawful but unnatural. Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, would call it the worst of sexual sins, for it turned the gift of generation into an act that mocked creation itself. Thus, when medieval chroniclers attached such rumours to Agrippina, they were not simply smearing her character. They were declaring her an enemy of both nature and God. She was not just a bad empress, she was a monster. But why Agrippina? Why Messalina? Why women of Rome's imperial household? The answer lies in their visibility. These women stood at the very centre of power. They were seen, they were whispered about, they were hated. Messalina, executed in AD 48 for her affair with Gaius Silius, was remembered in scandalous anecdotes. Agrippina, murdered in AD 59 by her son Nero, was remembered as the woman who ruled too boldly. In both cases, later writers needed to explain, or rather, to erase, how women could wield such power in a man's world. They erased them by turning them into grotesques. To accuse an empress of adultery was to strip her of virtue. To accuse her of incest was to strip her of humanity. But to accuse her of bestiality was to strip her of nature itself. She became not a woman, not even a human, but a creature of perverse appetite. This is why the stallion rumour mattered. It was not history, not a record of fact, not Tacitus or Suetonius, but it was something even more enduring. It was myth. It was a story designed to explain, to frighten, to enforce boundaries. The story said, women who seek power will become unnatural. Women who rise too high will be cast down not only by men, but by the memory of men. And once the rumour existed, it did not die. In the 15th century, Italian humanists retelling the corruption of the Caesars repeated it as though it were fact. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Protestant pamphleteers, condemning Catholic decadence, compared the papacy to Nero's Rome and invoked the names of Messalina and Agrippina, pairing them with tales of unnatural vice. By the 18th century, the Enlightenment remembered them as cautionary archetypes, their lives reduced to caricatures of lust and cruelty. Yet, the irony remains. The Romans themselves never told this story. Agrippina lived in a world of poison, daggers, and whispered incest. But horses, that came later. The stallions were the invention of those who feared not Agrippina the woman, but Agrippina the symbol, a symbol of female power, and therefore a danger that had to be recast as perversion. The charge of bestiality was never about truth. It was about annihilation. It was the ultimate tool of slander, the darkest whisper, the accusation that left no defence. For how could one argue innocence when accused of something so unnatural? How could reputation survive when one's very humanity was denied? And so, in the echoing halls of memory, Agrippina is remembered not for her diplomacy, not for her role in securing Nero's succession, not for her survival in the courts of Caligula and Claudius, but for the whisper of stallions. A whisper that said, she was no woman at all, she was a beast. That is why bestiality rumours mattered. Not because they were true, but because they killed truth. The year was AD 54, and the palace of Rome trembled with whispers. Emperor Claudius, aged and ailing, had ruled for nearly 13 years. He had survived court intrigues, freedman manipulations, and the scandals of Messalina. But now a new storm gathered, one that would end his reign and plunge Rome into the darkest of family dramas. At the centre stood his wife, Agrippina the Younger, and her son, the boy destined to become Rome's most infamous emperor, Nero. When Claudius collapsed in October, AD 54, ancient historians such as Tacitus, Annals 12.66, Suetonius, Claudius 44, and Cassius Dio, 60.34, suspected foul play. The rumour was simple. Agrippina had poisoned her husband at a banquet, using a dish of mushrooms laced with toxin. Some claim the poison was prepared by the notorious woman Locusta, later known as Rome's most infamous professional poisoner. Others said Agrippina hired the physician Xenophon to administer a poisoned feather to Claudius's throat as he choked. Whether true or not, Claudius was dead, and at the age of just 16, Nero, born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, renamed after adoption, was hailed Emperor of Rome. At first, Agrippina seemed triumphant. She had achieved what no Roman woman before her had done, placed her son on the throne while she still lived. She stood beside Nero at public appearances, often physically elevated on the dais, sharing the limelight. Coins were minted with Agrippina's image facing Nero's, a striking visual of her prominence. In AD 54-55, she was Rome's empress in all but name, wielding power not from the shadows but in dazzling daylight. But Rome was not prepared for a woman so visible. Tacitus paints the scene with venom. Agrippina walking with Nero in the litter, dining with him in public, greeting ambassadors at his side. To the senatorial class this was intolerable. To them a mother's guidance looked like dominance, her influence looked like seduction, and to enemies of Agrippina the easiest slander was already at hand. She must be sharing not just Nero's throne, but his bed. The seeds of the incest rumour sprouted here. Suetonius, Nero 28, and Cassius Dio, 62.28, claim Agrippina was seen reclining too familiarly with Nero, whispering too closely, even being discovered in compromising situations. Some reported that she was found in his chamber, dishevelled, when his tutors entered. Others claimed that Agrippina used her own body to keep Nero loyal against the rising influence of mistresses. Whether true or not, the imagery was effective. It cast her not as mother, but as corrupter. For Nero, the relationship quickly soured. In AD 55, his tutor Seneca and the praetorian prefect Burrus urged him to assert independence. Their advice worked. Nero dismissed Pallas, one of Agrippina's allies, from his treasury post. Soon after, he forbade Agrippina from meeting foreign ambassadors. By the end of AD 55, Agrippina had been forced out of the palace's inner circle, watching bitterly as her teenage son slipped from her control. The crisis deepened when Nero fell under the spell of Poppaea Sabina, a woman of beauty and ambition. Poppaea mocked Nero for being tied to his mother's strings, goading him with the suggestion that no man could rule while still dominated by a parent. Tacitus claims Poppaea taunted him, either break free of Agrippina or admit that he was not emperor at all. By AD 58, the court had fractured. Agrippina no longer appeared at Nero's side. Instead, she retreated to her villa at Antium, plotting her return. Some whispered that she sought to back her stepson Britannicus, son of Claudius and Messalina, as a rival claimant. If Britannicus could be crowned, she could still rule as the power behind the boy. But Britannicus was conveniently removed. In February AD 55, just months after Nero's accession, he died suddenly during a banquet. Tacitus darkly notes that he collapsed in front of guests and most suspected poison. Few doubted Nero's hand, though some whispered Agrippina. Herself had arranged it. Either way, her leverage was gone. The mother-son relationship now turned poisonous. Nero feared her, yet could not erase her completely. She still held networks of allies, among the praetorians, senators, and freedmen who had once served Claudius. Her very existence was a threat. By AD 59, the decision was made. Nero would rid himself of his mother forever. But Nero was no ordinary assassin. He wanted spectacle. According to Tacitus, Annals 14.3-8, the first plot was almost theatrical. At Baiae, on the Bay of Naples, he invited Agrippina to a banquet aboard a specially designed boat. The boat was built with a collapsible roof and sabotaged hull. The plan was simple. Agrippina would be crushed or drowned, and the emperor could claim it was an accident at sea. On the night of the banquet, Agrippina boarded the vessel. As she reclined on the couch, the roof collapsed, killing one of her attendants but sparing her. The hull then broke apart and the boat sank. Agrippina fell into the dark waters of the bay, but she could swim. Injured but alive, she made it to shore. Rome awoke to whispers that the Empress mother had survived her son's murder attempt. For Nero, this was catastrophic. Agrippina's survival was proof that the gods themselves seemed to shield her, and worse, she was alive to tell the tale. The emperor's fears escalated into paranoia. Within days, he sent assassins to her villa. Tacitus describes the scene with chilling drama. Agrippina confronted her killers defiantly, baring her womb and shouting, "Qui, strike here! Strike the womb that bore such a monster." She was stabbed to death in her villa. Her body burned quietly in the night. The year was AD 59. Agrippina was 44 years old. The woman who had been great-granddaughter of Augustus, sister of Caligula, wife of Claudius, and mother of Nero was gone. Her death shocked Rome, but Nero's power was now unchallenged, and yet whispers did not die. Instead, they multiplied. With Agrippina dead, her reputation was no longer defended by allies. Slander ran free. Suetonius, Dio, and later chroniclers wove her life into a tapestry of poison, incest, and monstrous lusts. The story of Nero's mother was rewritten as one of depravity, a mother who lay with her son, a woman who ruled like a man, and in later centuries an empress who lay even with beasts. This is why the war between Nero and Agrippina mattered so deeply. It was not just a family quarrel, it was a struggle over legitimacy itself. If Agrippina had succeeded, she might have reigned as the first true empress of Rome, guiding the empire through her son. Instead, Nero destroyed her and rewrote her memory. And in this rewriting, Rome revealed its deepest fear. Not that emperors could be mad, not that poison could shape dynasties, but that women could rise too high. Her life ended in blood. Her memory endured in whispers. History remembers Rome's empresses not by their voices but by the words of men. Messalina, Agrippina, Julia, even Livia. Their lives come down to us not in diaries, letters, or proclamations, but through the hostile pens of senatorial historians and satirists. And so what survives is not truth, but shadows. Shadows sharpened by slander, stretched by rumour, and cast deliberately to destroy. In the case of Messalina and Agrippina, their images were built by men like Tacitus, Suetonius, Juvenal, and Cassius Dio, all educated men of the Roman elite, all deeply suspicious of women in power, all writing decades after the events they described. Their works are the scaffolding on which later generations built the legend of the Empress who slept with her stallions. To understand the scandal, one must first understand the pens that wrote it. Tacitus, circa AD 56 to 120, a senator of Rome, wrote his annals during the reigns of Trajan and Hadrian, long after the Julio-Claudian dynasty had collapsed. Tacitus is celebrated for his grave style and moral gravity, but his lens is unmistakable. He despised the corruption of the imperial court, and especially the influence of imperial women. His annals are full of whispers, Messalina's brothel, Agrippina's incest, and though he often hints at doubt, he records the rumour anyway, ensuring that it survives. In Annals 11, he describes Messalina's supposed mock marriage with Gaius Silius, portraying her as reckless with lust and blind to danger. In Annals 13 and 14, he writes of Agrippina's closeness with Nero, how the public thought their relationship not motherly. Tacitus rarely declares slander as fact, but his careful record makes sure that the mud stuck. Suetonius, circa AD 69 to 122, was less subtle. Serving as imperial secretary under Emperor Hadrian, he had access to archives, gossip, and scandal sheets. His Lives of the Caesars is part biography, part scandal catalogue. In his Life of Nero, 28, he repeats the whispers that Agrippina lay with her son, writing that he abstained from sleeping with her only because of his friend's interference. Elsewhere, in Claudius 26, he portrays Messalina as addicted to sex, competing in a brothel against prostitutes. Suetonius does not veil rumour in moral hesitation. He gleefully records it. He saw scandal as truth's equal, and in doing so, he cemented scandal as the memory of Rome. Juvenal, active late 1st, early 2nd century AD, was not a historian but a satirist, and satire is a dangerous lens through which to see history. His Satire 6, one of the most venomous texts in Latin literature, spares no cruelty for women. It is in this text that he claims Messalina disguised herself and worked all night in a brothel, competing with prostitutes to see who could outlast the other. Juvenal does not claim evidence. He does not even pretend. He writes exaggeration, grotesque imagery, and caricature. But because satire survives, it fuses with history. Later generations are unable to distinguish mockery from reality, repeated Juvenal's verses as though they were fact. Cassius Dio, circa AD 155 to 235, writing more than a century after Tacitus and Suetonius, added another layer. His Roman history covers nearly a millennium, and though he drew from earlier sources, he embroidered them with new flourishes. His accounts of Messalina and Agrippina follow the same path: lust, incest, ambition, downfall. Dio presents Agrippina as scheming, insatiable, and doomed. His distance in time did not cool the slander, it magnified it, as every retelling hardened rumour into fact. This is the tragedy. Rome's empresses have no surviving defence. Messalina left no letters. Agrippina wrote memoirs. Tacitus himself mentions them, Annals 4.53, but those memoirs are lost. If they survived, we might read her life in her own words. Instead, all we hear are the voices of her enemies, and in their voices she's always monstrous. The biases are clear when examined. Tacitus and Dio were senators. Their class had been stripped of power by emperors, and they resented the household figures who seemed to wield influence, freedmen, eunuchs, and women. Suetonius wrote for entertainment, leaning into scandal because scandal sold. Juvenal thrived on exaggeration, turning Rome's darkest fears into grotesque portraits of women with endless appetites. What unites these writers is not their style, but their perspective. They were men who saw women in politics as aberrations. The ideal Roman woman was silent, modest, invisible. Livia, wife of Augustus, was remembered for her prudence, though even she was later accused of poison. Agrippina and Messalina, by contrast, were not invisible. They sat in councils, negotiated marriages, stood in processions, minted coins. To the Roman mind, this visibility itself was scandal, and so slander filled the space where truth once stood. The incest rumour against Agrippina is a perfect example. No contemporary inscription, no legal record, no document accuses her of lying with her son. Yet Tacitus, Suetonius and Dio all report that some said she did. The careful phrase, alia tradunt, others relate, is the historian's escape clause. Tacitus avoids claiming it directly, but by recording it, he immortalizes it. The rumour became history simply because a respected historian refused to let it die. Likewise, the brothel tale of Messalina is uncorroborated outside satire. No edict, no trial record, no inscription mentions her nights as a prostitute. Yet Juvenal's savage verses were copied by scribes, read by monks, retold in medieval chronicles. By the time the Renaissance rediscovered Rome, Messalina's brothel had become her defining fact. The pens of slander had long reach. In the Middle Ages, chroniclers took Tacitus and Suetonius at their word, adding even darker embellishments. Agrippina was no longer merely accused of incest. Now she was accused of bestiality, the whispered Stallions myth that gave this story its title. By the time her image reached the early modern world, she was the archetype of the monstrous mother, the perverse empress, the she-wolf who devoured her own blood. And so Rome's cruelest whispers were not accidents. They were weapons, political weapons in life, literary weapons in death. Messalina and Agrippina died violently, one executed in gardens, the other stabbed in her villa, but their reputations were executed too, on parchment, in ink. The question remains, did Tacitus believe what he wrote? Did Suetonius? Or did they record gossip because gossip was irresistible? Tacitus, the most careful of the three, often distances himself from rumour, using words like phame, report, or creditor, it is believed. He may not have believed it, but he believed it mattered. Rumour itself was power, a reflection of Rome's moral judgment. In this way, history became inseparable from slander. Messalina is remembered not for being mother of Britannicus and Octavia, nor for her role in Claudius's court, but for the image of her in a brothel bed. Agrippina is remembered not for being great-granddaughter of Augustus, or for guiding her son to the throne, but for the image of her in her son's bed. The pen of slander stripped them of politics and reduced them to bodies, always sexualized, always monstrous. This is Rome's paradox. Its women shaped dynasties, built networks, bore emperors, but its historians refused to let them be political actors. Instead, they became characters in a morality tale, a warning of what happens when women rise too high. The sword killed their bodies, but the pen killed their memory. And in many ways, the pen was sharper. History does not remember Valeria Messalina and Julia Agrippina the Younger as women, but as symbols. Across the centuries, their names became less about flesh and blood lives and more about archetypes, narrative moulds into which male historians poured their fears, their hatreds, and their fantasies. Messalina was lust incarnate. Agrippina was power embodied. Together they formed the dark mirror of Roman femininity, one devoured by her body, the other consumed by her ambition. The Roman imagination, sharpened by poets and historians, needed such figures. Rome was obsessed with virtue and vice, with order and chaos. Its political narratives thrived on contrasts. Augustus the saviour, Nero the monster, Livia the prudent matron, Messalina the whore. The lives of Messalina and Agrippina provided fertile ground for this binary storytelling, because both women stood too close to the throne, and women near power had to be explained. Male chroniclers explained them not with politics, but with archetype. Messalina's story, drawn from Tacitus, Suetonius and Juvenal, was always carnal. She was born between AD 17 and 20, related by blood to Caligula, cousin to Nero, and married to Claudius at perhaps 18 or 20 years of age. Yet in the pages of Rome's writers, she is never young, never naive, never political. She is instead insatiable. Juvenal seizes on her as a grotesque image of female lust, claiming she disguised herself at night to work in a brothel under the name Lysiska. The wolf bitch. He insists she competed with prostitutes in a contest of endurance, satisfying 25 men in one night and returning home unweary to Claudius. Tacitus is less lurid, but still portrays her as reckless in desire, culminating in her scandalous marriage to Gaius Silius in AD 48. Her downfall is framed not as political manoeuvring, but as sexual frenzy. She's remembered not for being mother to Britannicus and Octavia, but for being Rome's whore. Agrippina the Younger's narrative runs along a different axis. Born in AD 15, great-granddaughter of Augustus, sister to Caligula, wife and niece of Claudius, and mother to Nero, she was one of the most politically connected women in Rome's history. But where Messalina is lust, Agrippina is ambition. Tacitus presents her as ruthless, orchestrating marriages, poisoning rivals, even arranging Claudius's death in AD 54 to secure the throne for Nero. Suetonius casts her as domineering, sitting with ambassadors, sharing the imperial litter, intruding into masculine spaces. Later chroniclers exaggerated her closeness to Nero into whispers of incest, claiming they were seen reclining together, or worse, sharing a bed. Whether true or not mattered little. The archetype stuck. Agrippina was the mother who ruled through her son, the empress who would stop at nothing. Her downfall in AD 59, when Nero ordered her murder at Baiae, was framed as the inevitable fate of a woman who wanted to rule men. Messalina and Agrippina thus became paired opposites in Roman cultural memory. One represented the dangers of unrestrained female sexuality, the other, the perils of unrestrained female ambition. Together, they offered moral lessons. Women who strayed beyond the domestic sphere would be destroyed, not just in life, but in reputation. This duality had precedent in Rome's cultural imagination. The poet Ovid, writing in the age of Augustus, had already cast women in archetypes: the chaste matron, the adulterous lover, the scheming witch. Later writers applied these moulds to imperial women. Messalina became the adulterous lover raised to monstrous scale. Agrippina became the witch queen, feared for her dominion over men. In each case, rumour replaced reality. The actual evidence for these archetypes is thin. Messalina's supposed brothel escapades come only from Juvenal, a satirist, and Suetonius, a collector of gossip. Tacitus, while critical, never mentions her brothel. Her political role in the court of Claudius is obscured beneath layers of sexual slander. Agrippina's incest rumour, repeated by Tacitus, Annals 13.2, and Suetonius, Nero 28, is hedged with disclaimers. Some said it was believed, yet these whispers became the centerpiece of her memory, overshadowing her real achievements, arranging alliances, stabilizing succession, and governing Rome in the early years of Nero's reign. The archetypes served a political function. They justified the elimination of these women by transforming them into monsters. Messalina's execution in AD 48 was not just the removal of a conspirator, it was the cleansing of a city supposedly polluted by her lust. Agrippina's murder in AD 59 was not just a dynastic purge, it was the silencing of a woman who, in the words of Tacitus, yearned for power with a man's passion. By casting them as a lust and power, Rome could rationalize their deaths. Later history doubled down on these archetypes. Medieval chroniclers, copying from Suetonius and Dio, added new horrors. Messalina became the ultimate prostitute, invoked in sermons as the embodiment of fornication. Agrippina became the archetypal bad mother, accused in dark whispers of coupling with animals, her stallions, her son. Renaissance and Baroque artists painted them as femmes fatales, bare-breasted, entwined with symbols of decadence. The archetypes had broken free of their origins, becoming timeless warnings about women and power. What is striking is how little of Messalina or Agrippina survives outside these moulds. We have inscriptions, coins, and references that confirm their marriages, their children, their presence in ceremonies. But none of these artifacts carry the weight of the scandal. Coins showing Agrippina beside Claudius, co-ruling in AD 50, speak of influence and legitimacy. Yet historians look past the coinage and repeat the whispers of incest. An inscription naming Messalina as mother of Britannicus and Octavia shows her as dynastic matron. Yet in memory she is Lysiska, the wolf bitch in the brothel. The archetypes were more powerful than the facts. In this way, Messalina and Agrippina illustrate how women in Rome were remembered not for what they did, but for what men feared they might do. Messalina was a fear of lust uncontrolled, a woman whose body could topple dynasties. Agrippina was a fear of ambition unchecked, a woman whose will could rule emperors. Together they became warnings disguised as history. This is why the title of this story, The Empress Who Slept with Her Stallions, resonates so deeply. It is not a fact. No Roman chronicler records it as contemporary truth, but as a rumour, it encapsulates the archetype. It is the ultimate symbol of slander made myth. A queen reduced to the grotesque, a woman remade as monster, a whisper magnified until it became memory. Messalina and Agrippina live on not as people, but as shadows. And perhaps this is the cruelest irony. Both women sought to shape the empire, Messalina through alliances and intrigues, Agrippina through calculated control of succession. Both left children who would shape Rome's destiny. Yet when we speak their names today, we do not remember their politics. We remember their archetypes, lust and power, brothel and bed, scandal and whisper. That is the legacy of Rome's cruelest rumour. There are whispers that never die. They move like smoke through time, impossible to grasp, but suffocating all the same. For the women of Rome's imperial household, no rumour was more poisonous than the accusation of lust that defied nature itself. The whisper of bestiality, of coupling with animals, of a queen in bed with her stallions. It is a story we must tread carefully with, because in the archives of antiquity, the words are thin, scattered, ambiguous. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio spoke with venom of Messalina and Agrippina, but none explicitly accused them of coupling with beasts. That particular slander seems to have been born in later centuries, shaped by medieval chroniclers who looked back at Rome through lenses clouded with their own fears. But like all good lies, it found its seed in Rome's soil, in the Roman obsession with the idea of contra naturam, the sin against nature. Roman law and morality drew clear lines around sexual behaviour. Adultery was a betrayal of family order, incest was a corruption of bloodlines, but bestiality, stuprum cum bestes, was an abomination, the very image of chaos triumphing over civilization. To accuse a woman of it was not to suggest a hidden affair, but to paint her as a monster, not human, not even woman, something outside the moral order. And so, in the centuries after their deaths, whispers grew that Messalina, insatiable in her lust, had not been content with men, that Agrippina, bold in her ambition, had crossed not just the line of politics, not just the line of incest, but the line between humanity and animal. The Empress with her stallions, it was never meant as fact, it was meant as obliteration. The seeds of this whisper can be traced to Juvenal, writing in the late 1st or early 2nd century AD. His Satire 6 describes Messalina sneaking from the palace at night, casting off her crown and working in a brothel under the name Lysiska. She was tired not even when dismissed last of all. Juvenal was not writing history. He was writing moral outrage, satire sharpened to a dagger. But his caricature planted the image of Messalina as a creature without limit. If she could take 25 men in a day, why not beasts? The leap was small in the imagination of later ages. Agrippina too became vulnerable to such exaggerations. Tacitus, Annals 13.2, reported rumours of incest with Nero, noting that she was said to have offered herself to him to maintain her influence. Suetonius, Nero 28, repeated whispers that they were seen in bed together. Dio added flourishes of her shameless ambition. These reports framed Agrippina not just as mother, but as seductress of her son. Once that boundary had been crossed in rumour, the imagination could drag her further. If she could sleep with Nero, why not with the beasts in her stables? The medieval mind delighted in this kind of embellishment. By the 12th and 13th centuries, chroniclers like John of Salisbury and later moralists took the Roman archetypes and embroidered them with grotesque details. Messalina became the prostitute empress in Christian sermons, invoked as a warning against lust. Agrippina became the mother of monstrous Nero, and her ambition and rumoured incest were twisted into darker stories, whispers of animal lust, of the stallions that would forever stain her memory. These tales were not about evidence, they were about moral theatre, about painting the pagan empire in the darkest hues so that Christian virtue would shine brighter by contrast. And yet, even knowing this, the whisper clings. For nearly 2 millennia, writers have repeated it in some form. Some cautiously note that Agrippina was accused of unnatural passions. Others boldly declare she lay with her horses. Each repetition cements the image, until fact and slander are indistinguishable. Why was this the cruelest whisper of all? Because it was annihilation. A woman accused of adultery might still be remembered as human. A woman accused of incest could still be imagined as mother, however corrupted. But a woman accused of bestiality became something else entirely. She became monstrous, a cautionary tale, a freak beyond the boundaries of nature. Rome's most powerful women were reduced not just to vice, but to myth. This whisper also reveals the deepest anxieties of the men who wrote it. Roman and later Christian chroniclers were terrified of women who stepped beyond the private sphere. A wife who cheated could shame her husband, but a wife who ruled could unmake the order of the world. The rumour of the Stallions was the ultimate expression of that fear. It said, "This is what happens when women hunger for power. They become unnatural. They become less than human." The truth, of course, was far different. Messalina was a young woman, perhaps 18 when she married Claudius, who navigated a court of freedmen, senators, and generals more experienced and ruthless than she. Agrippina was one of the shrewdest political minds of her age, who manoeuvred herself from exile under Caligula to Empress beside Claudius to mother of the emperor. Their lives were consumed by politics, family rivalries, and survival in a dynasty drenched with blood. But in memory, those complexities were erased. A single rumour outlived them all. The cruelest whisper is the one that silences truth, the one that grows louder with time until it drowns out all else. For Messalina and Agrippina, that whisper was not simply that they were adulteresses, or plotters, or even murderers. It was that they were not women at all, but creatures of lust so vile that even the stallions of their stables were not safe. When we repeat their names today, it is almost impossible to separate them from that shadow. Messalina, the brothel queen. Agrippina, the empress with her son, the empress with her stallions. These are the images that cling, not the coins bearing their profiles, not the laws or decrees they influenced, not the dynastic stability they forged. The rumour outlasted the woman, and perhaps this is why chapter 14 must carry such weight. For here we see the final stage of slander, the transformation of human into monster. Messalina and Agrippina were flesh and blood, mothers and wives, players in Rome's greatest dynasty. But Rome and its chroniclers stripped them of that piece by piece until only archetype remained. And then, in the cruelest twist, even the archetype was pushed beyond the human, into the grotesque, into the impossible. The empress who slept with her stallions. It was never true, but it was never meant to be. It was meant to endure, and it has. It is a D59, and the waves of Baiae roll quietly against the shore. The sun has fallen, and in the villa where Agrippina once ruled with regal presence, the shadows are long. The place still smells of salt and smoke, though the night of her death is now only memory. Once this villa echoed with the sound of senators, freedmen, and courtiers bowing to her power. Now it is silent, a mausoleum of whispers. Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, sister of Caligula, granddaughter of Augustus, has just met her end. The collapse of the boat designed to drown her failed, and so Nero's assassins came with swords. They drove their blades into her body, silencing the woman who had raised an emperor. Tacitus writes that her last words were almost defiant. "Strike my womb." Let the very place that bore Nero take the blow. Whether the words are true or embroidered, they reveal what she had become in memory. A womb first, a scandal second, and a shadow always. But as her blood seeped into the floor of her villa, her story did not end. It transformed. For Rome did not bury women like Agrippina in peace. Rome reforged them into symbols, and so she, like Messalina before her, became less than a woman, more than a rumour, and eternal in infamy. Messalina had died earlier, in AD 48, executed in the gardens of Lucullus after Claudius learned of her marriage to Gaius Silius. The blade struck her in youth. She was not yet 30. Her children, Octavia and Britannicus, were left in the palace, their mother's name poisoned, her legacy reduced to the words of Juvenal, Tacitus, and Dio. To them, she was the whore Empress. Never mind her alliances, her role in court factions, her motherhood. What remained was the rumour, the brothel at night, the endless lust, the image of Rome's greatest prostitute hidden behind imperial walls. Agrippina's story ran longer, but the conclusion was the same. For years she had wielded immense influence, steering Claudius's policies, elevating Nero, consolidating Julio-Claudian power. Yet the moment she crossed her son, her power became a curse. Whispers of incest, of ambition, of monstrous desire were waiting to drown her. By the time her corpse lay cooling, the rumour had already outlived her body. The cruelest whisper, the Empress with her stallions, would not even need to be said aloud in her lifetime. It could take root centuries later, woven into Christian sermons and medieval moral tales. That is the true horror of slander. It has no expiry date. Once spoken, it waits in the air, ready for a new age to pick it up, twist it, and pass it on. Agrippina did not live to hear that whisper, but it would follow her name forever. What strikes us now, looking back, is the pattern. These women, caught in the gears of empire, were not remembered for what they built, or the bloodlines they preserved, or the empires they shaped. They were remembered for what men accused them of: Messalina, lust; Agrippina, incest; both, monstrousness. And then, in the final refinement of slander, the Stallions. A grotesque fabrication meant not to record history, but to erase humanity. Think of it. The Roman world was one of constant bloodshed. Emperors poisoned brothers, generals slaughtered tens of thousands, citizens starved while palaces glittered. Yet it was not violence that damned Messalina or Agrippina in memory. It was sex, not even sex proven, but sex imagined, rumoured, whispered. That was the weapon sharp enough to cut deeper than steel. And so, centuries later, when the name Messalina is spoken, it conjures not her lineage, not her daughter Octavia's tragic marriage to Nero, not her son Britannicus poisoned at 16. It conjures a brothel and 25 men. When Agrippina is remembered, it is not for elevating her son to the throne, nor for her role in shaping the Julio-Claudian dynasty, nor for being the last of Augustus's bloodline to stand at Rome's helm. It is for whispers of incest with Nero, for the grotesque rumour of stallions. This is the shadow of slander. It buries fact, exalts fiction, and reshapes human beings into monsters. And the longer it lingers, the more it seems like truth. Step now into the silence of Agrippina's villa. The walls are gone, the marble worn down, but imagine the sea breeze carrying voices, senators murmuring their condemnation, historians sharpening their quills, poets readying their satires. None of them preserve her as she was. All of them craft her as she needed to be for their purposes. Tacitus, writing decades later, offers her as a lesson in ambition. Suetonius delights in the salacious. Juvenal makes her kind, women of the palace, into monsters for his readers to mock. And later, Christian chroniclers take their words, add new layers of grotesque, and shape her into something unrecognizable. From flesh to fable, from woman to beast, from ruler to rumour. But if we strip away the slander, if we silence the cruelest whisper, what remains? A young woman, born into the imperial house in AD 15, surviving exile under Caligula, clawing her way back to power, marrying her uncle Claudius to place her, son on the throne. Another young woman, Messalina, barely out of girlhood, married off to an emperor 30 years her senior, navigating a court of knives, raising 2 children, crushed in her 20s. These were their lives, these were their realities, but they are not what Rome chose to remember. History prefers its women simple. Messalina became lust, Agrippina became power. Both were stripped of nuance, turned into archetypes, and then twisted into grotesque shadows. Their truth is lost in the rumour, their humanity drowned in the whisper. Tonight, in our telling, we walk back through those marble halls. We do not linger on the brothel door, or the litters Nero and Agrippina shared, or the imagined stables. We stop at their silence, at Messalina's final breath in the gardens, at Agrippina's body on the villa floor. and we remember that behind every slander was a woman who lived, who ruled, who was destroyed not by what she did, but by what others chose to say. Perhaps this is why the story lingers, not because of its truth, but because of its warning. Power, when worn by women, was so threatening to Rome that rumour became a weapon sharper than any sword, and rumour once unleashed does not die. It becomes eternal. Messalina, Agrippina, the names echo, the whispers follow. The Stallions still paw the ground, centuries later, not because they ever existed, but because rumour feeds on silence, and the women cannot speak for themselves. And so, as dawn breaks over Baiae, we close our story. The sea is calm. The villa stands in shadow. Messalina lies forgotten in her garden grave, Agrippina beneath the Roman soil. But their ghosts walk still, not as they were, but as rumour made them. The truth has been lost to time. The whispers remain. And in the cruelest irony of all, Rome remembers them not as empresses, but as monsters born of slander,